I had finally done it. After years of saving, researching, and dreaming, I bought my very own mountain cabin. Nestled high among the pine-covered peaks, it was the kind of place I had imagined countless times in my mind. Quiet, serene, and completely mine. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of evergreen, and the distant sound of a river trickling down the valley added a soundtrack of peace that I had longed for. The cabin itself was rustic but charming, with weathered wooden beams, a stone chimney, and a porch that seemed to stretch endlessly into the forest. Each morning I pictured myself stepping onto that porch, coffee in hand, as the sun peeked over the mountaintops. The birds would sing, the wind would whisper through the trees, and for the first time in years, I would feel free. Driving up the winding mountain road the day I took ownership, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with relief. This wasn't just a property, it was a sanctuary, a retreat from the chaos and noise of the city, the kind of place where I could finally think, breathe, and live on my own terms. I parked my truck in front of the cabin, stepped out, and let the morning sunlight wash over me. The peace I had longed for was palpable. For a moment, I thought life couldn't get any better. Then, almost immediately, reality intruded. In the mailbox, among the welcome pamphlets and property tax notices, there was a single envelope that caught my eye. Its thick paper and embossed letters signaled something official. I reached for it, curiosity and unease twisting together in my stomach. As I tore it open, my heart sank. It was a letter from the local HOA, and the words on that page changed everything. They claimed my cabin was under their jurisdiction and that it must comply with their rules, fees, and annexation requirements. At first, I thought I must be misunderstanding something. Surely, too, his was a mistake. My property papers, signed and notarized, clearly showed that the cabin was mine. I had bought it legally, fair and square. But the HOA was insistent. They listed fines, penalties, and legal obligations, all of which I had never agreed to. They warned me of annexation, as if my cabin could suddenly be swallowed into their control without my consent. A chill ran down my spine as I read and reread the letter. The peace I had dreamed of, the sanctuary I had built in my mind, suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces I had never imagined. I stood there on the porch, the morning sun hitting my face, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Anger bubbled up inside me, but so did disbelief. How could something I worked so hard for, something that was mine, be challenged before I even had a chance to enjoy it? The serene mountain morning I had envisioned now felt like the calm before a storm. I looked around at the cabin, at the towering trees, the distant mountains, the river flowing below, and realized that my dream of peace had come with an unexpected price. I had not just bought a cabin, I had stepped into a legal battlefield, and the opponent was far more organized and far more intimidating than I had imagined. I thought I bought a cabin, not a legal battlefield, I whispered to myself, gripping the railing of the porch. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let the HOA take this from me without a fight. The next morning, I awoke to a sense of unease I couldn't shake. The cabin, once a haven of peace, suddenly felt smaller, confined by invisible chains. The HOA letter from the day before had opened a door I never expected to walk through, a world of rules, restrictions, and overreach. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope again. How could an organization dictate what I did with my own property? I began researching the HOA online. Their reputation wasn't exactly comforting. They were strict, overreaching, and, in some accounts, downright aggressive. Stories of neighbors fined hundreds, even thousands of dollars for minor infractions were common. Apparently, every lawn, fence, and even the color of a mailbox had to adhere to their arbitrary rules. But what unsettled me most was their reach. They claimed jurisdiction over properties like mine that weren't even within their original community plan. A few more letters arrived that week. Each one carried a heavier tone than the last. One demanded that I submit my cabin to their regulations immediately. Another threatened fines if I failed to comply. A third hinted at legal action and annexation, stating in no uncertain terms that my property could be absorbed into their territory regardless of my ownership. Reading them, I could feel the walls closing in, and my blood boiled with a mix of frustration and disbelief. I remember pacing the cabin that afternoon, the pine-scented air doing little to calm my mind. "How can they even claim this land?" I muttered, shaking my head. I had the deeds, I had the signed contracts, and yet here were strangers in suits, wielding threats as if they were law. They weren't just a neighborhood association. They were an institution determined to assert power over anyone who dared live outside their control. Anger and fear clashed inside me. On one hand, I wanted to storm down to their office and demand an explanation. On the other, I knew I needed a plan. These people thrived on intimidation. They relied on people reacting impulsively. I had to stay calm, or I would give them the satisfaction of thinking they could control me. That night, I sat by the fireplace, staring at the flickering flames, letting the shadows dance across the walls. I reviewed the letters again and again, annotating every threat, every claim, every fine. Each sentence reminded me of the uphill battle ahead. But amidst the tension, a thought began to form. If they believed they could scare me into submission, they had another thing coming. I wasn't just dealing with an HOA. I was dealing with a system that assumed fear equaled compliance. And I wasn't afraid. Not yet. Not while this cabin, this dream I had worked so hard for, was at stake. By the end of the week, the reality had set in. The HOA had made their intentions clear. They were not going to back down. And neither was I. The stage was set for a legal battle, one that would test my patience, my resolve, and my understanding of property law. As I looked out over the mountains, the sunset casting long shadows across the cabin, I clenched my fists and whispered to myself, if they want to fight, they're going to get one. I won't let them take what's mine. For the first time, the serenity of the mountains was tainted by tension. But in that tension was determination. The real journey had begun. After the first wave of HOA threats, I knew I couldn't fight blindly. Anger alone wouldn't protect my cabin. I needed facts, evidence, and a deep understanding of what these people could and couldn't do. For the next few days, my cabin became less of a retreat and more of a research station. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, cross-referencing property deeds, county records, and HOA bylaws. Every detail mattered. Every sentence could be a key piece of the puzzle. The first discovery was shocking. According to the county records, my property had never been part of the original HOA plan. The boundaries were clearly marked, and my parcel was outside any jurisdiction the HOA could legally claim. Yet somehow, they believed they had the right to impose fines, rules, and even annexation. Their letters had no legal foundation, at least not on paper, but they relied on intimidation and the assumption that most people wouldn't question them. Next, I dug into the HOA's governing documents. The bylaws were dense and filled with legal jargon, but one thing stood out immediately. They were careful to define the limits of their authority. Annexation of properties outside the original subdivision required votes, legal notices, and approval from the county. None of these steps had been taken. The HOA's claims weren't just aggressive, they were blatantly illegal. As I read through past meeting minutes and newsletters, a pattern emerged. This wasn't an isolated incident. The HOA had a history of targeting outsiders who didn't belong to their network. They sent letters, threatened fines, and pressured homeowners to comply with their demands, often without any legal standing. Their reputation for bullying people into submission was well earned, but this time I wouldn't be an easy target. I started documenting everything. Letters were scanned and time-stamped. Photos of the cabin and property boundaries were taken from multiple angles. I created a timeline of HOA communications, marking threats and inconsistencies in their claims. Each discovery reinforced my confidence. I had the law on my side, and they were relying solely on fear to assert control. Still, the more I uncovered, the more I realized the magnitude of what I was up against. The HOA wasn't just a neighborhood association. They were a well-organized entity with a network of members, lawyers, and resources. If they truly wanted to push me out or annex my cabin, they could drag me into months of costly legal battles. But knowledge, I realized, was my greatest weapon. By understanding their overreach, I could anticipate their moves and prepare a defense that would leave them no room to maneuver. Late one night, as I sat by the cabin's fireplace, surrounded by stacks of documents and glowing from my laptop screen, a sense of clarity washed over me. The fight wasn't just about protecting a piece of land. It was about standing up to an organization that assumed compliance was automatic. I knew this battle would require patience, strategy, and precision. But for the first time, I also felt a surge of confidence. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flickering shadows on the walls, and whispered to myself, "They didn't expect me to fight back. They have no idea what's coming." By the end of that week, I had gathered enough evidence to confront the HOA, not with anger or threats, but with facts, law, and strategy. I felt ready to take the next step, a legal challenge that would force them to face the reality of their overreach. The battlefield was set, and I was no longer just a homeowner. I was a prepared, determined opponent. The real war had begun. By the time I filed the first documents with the county, I knew the fight had officially begun. The cabin that once symbolized peace now felt like the center of a storm. I spent hours drafting letters, organizing evidence, and meeting with my lawyer to ensure every point was airtight. Every document I submitted had to be precise. Any mistake could give the HOA an opening. The HOA didn't waste any time responding. Within days, I received another stack of letters, each more aggressive than the last. They accused me of ignoring rules, violating community standards, and even suggested that my cabin could be seized if I didn't comply. I read them with a mix of disbelief and frustration. It was clear they were trying to intimidate me into submission. I refused to be intimidated. Instead, I used their letters as part of my defense. Every threat, every overreach, and every false claim became evidence that the HOA was acting outside the bounds of their authority. I cataloged their communications meticulously, creating a paper trail that left no doubt about their overreach. The legal preparation consumed me. Days were spent reviewing county property maps, analyzing HOA bylaws, and preparing a timeline of every interaction. Nights were spent on the porch, staring at the mountains, trying to maintain focus despite the stress. The more I delved into the case, the more I realized just how systematic the HOA's tactics were. They relied on fear and bureaucracy to push people into compliance, assuming that most homeowners would back down rather than fight a drawn-out battle. But I wasn't most homeowners. I had documents, research, and a clear understanding of the law on my side. I also had something they underestimated: determination. I began drafting my legal arguments, carefully pointing out the steps the HOA had skipped and the laws they had ignored. I worked closely with my lawyer to anticipate every counterattack they might throw at me. As the court date approached, the tension grew. Each day brought new letters and hints of escalation. The HOA tried subtle intimidation, emails, phone calls, even showing up near the cabin under the guise of inspection. I remained calm, documenting everything. Their aggression only strengthened my resolve. Finally, the day arrived. I walked into the courthouse carrying a folder filled with evidence, notes, and legal filings. The stakes felt higher than ever. I wasn't just defending a piece of property. I was standing up to an institution that assumed compliance was inevitable. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and formality. a place where every word, every gesture could tip the balance. My lawyer and I presented our case with precision. Every piece of evidence, every loophole the HOA had ignored, every illegal claim was laid out clearly. The HOA countered aggressively, citing their own bylaws and past precedents, but the cracks in their strategy were already visible. Each time they overstepped, I silently noted it, knowing the judge would see through the intimidation. By the end of the day, I felt exhausted but resolute. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I sensed that the tide was turning. I had turned their own tactics against them, using evidence, law, and logic to expose the limits of their power. The courtroom had become the battlefield, and I had positioned myself to win. As I left the courthouse that evening, the mountains stretching endlessly beyond the city, I realized the journey was far from over. The HOA had underestimated me, and I intended to make them pay for every ounce of stress and intimidation they had tried to bring into my life. The real showdown, the final verdict, was still ahead. The morning of the hearing arrived with a crisp chill in the air. I drove up to the courthouse, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The mountains behind me seemed calm and indifferent, unaware of the storm about to unfold inside the courtroom. I carried with me the weight of every document, every letter, every piece of evidence I had painstakingly gathered. This was it, the moment where all the preparation, research, and late nights would be put to the test. Walking through the courthouse doors, I felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. The courtroom was formal and intimidating, with polished wooden benches, tall ceilings, and a sense of authority that demanded respect. The HOA representatives were already there, neatly dressed, their smug expressions hinting at confidence. They had faced many homeowners before and assumed I would be no different. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Her presence alone commanded attention. As she took her seat, the tension in the air was palpable. The HOA attorney began first, presenting their claims with practiced precision. They argued that my cabin fell under their jurisdiction and cited selective clauses from their bylaws, trying to make their annexation attempt seem legitimate. Their words were measured, their tone authoritative, but I could see the cracks forming. When it was our turn, my lawyer laid out the case with calm authority. Every letter from the HOA was presented as evidence of overreach. Each document was highlighted, showing how they ignored legal procedures, bypassed county approvals, and relied solely on intimidation. Maps were displayed, clearly proving that my property was outside the HOA's legal boundaries. We walked the judge through a timeline of every communication, demonstrating a pattern of coercion and illegitimate claims. As I listened from the gallery, I felt a mix of anxiety and quiet satisfaction. The truth was undeniable. The HOA had built their argument on assumptions, fear, and half-truths. Our defense was grounded in law, facts, and meticulously documented evidence. Every time the HOA tried to shift the narrative, my lawyer countered with precision, leaving little room for doubt. The room grew tense as the judge asked pointed questions, probing the HOA's authority, the annexation process, and their adherence to county regulations. The HOA attorney fumbled on several points, struggling to explain gaps in their claims. I could feel the tide turning. The calm authority of the court seemed to weigh against them, and their confident facade began to crack. After hours of arguments, presentations, and tense exchanges, the judge leaned back and paused, considering the evidence carefully. Silence filled the courtroom as everyone waited. Then came the words I had been hoping for, the verdict that would restore peace to my mountain retreat. The claims of the HOA are hereby denied. The property in question is not under the jurisdiction of the HOA, and any attempt to annex it is invalid. Relief washed over me like a wave. The tension that had gripped my chest for weeks finally released. The HOA representatives shifted uncomfortably, their confidence shattered. My cabin, my sanctuary, was officially mine. The judge's ruling was clear, final, and just. As I stepped out of the courthouse later that afternoon, the sun breaking through the clouds, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The battle had been long, stressful, and intimidating, but standing up with evidence, preparation, and determination had won the day. I had faced an organization that assumed power through fear, and I had proven that knowledge and resolve could triumph over intimidation. That night, back at the cabin, I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the pier. The mountains stretched endlessly before me, serene and untouched, just as I had dreamed. But now, they were also a symbol of victory. I had fought for my home, and I had won. Peace at last. But vigilance is key, I whispered, knowing the fight for what's yours is never over, but feeling confident that I had defended what mattered most. The days after the courtroom victory were quiet, almost surreal. Driving back to my cabin, the mountains looked the same as ever, majestic, calm, and seemingly untouched by the chaos that had consumed my life for weeks. Yet everything had changed. I had not only defended my property, but I had also learned invaluable lessons about perseverance, preparation, and standing up to intimidation. Returning to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief and contentment. I unpacked boxes I had left behind in the chaos of legal battles, arranged furniture, and reopened windows to let the fresh mountain air flow freely. Every sound, the wind rustling the pine needles, the distant river, the occasional call of a hawk, reminded me why I had sought this sanctuary in the first place. My home was mine, legally and unequivocally. But peace did not come immediately. I remained vigilant, reviewing property boundaries, double-checking documents, and even contacting the county one more time to ensure there would be no future disputes. The HOA might have lost this battle, but organizations like them are persistent. Their strategy relied on wearing people down, hoping homeowners would give up. I now understood that ownership came with responsibility, not just to care for the land, but to protect it fiercely. During this time, I reflected on the journey. The fight was more than just a legal battle. It was a test of resolve. I had faced letters full of threats, intimidating representatives, and the looming possibility of a drawn-out, costly legal fight. Each step had required calm thinking, research, and strategy. It became clear that knowledge is power. The more prepared you are, the harder it is for others to manipulate or bully you. I also realized the importance of documenting everything. Each letter, each email, each encounter with the HOA had been preserved. Without that evidence, I might have been swallowed by their intimidation tactics. Their arrogance had been their weakness. They assumed fear would silence me. Instead, preparation and patience became my strongest allies. Walking around the cabin one evening, I paused at the edge of the porch and looked out over the valley below. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the forest. It was peaceful, yet I knew this was only part of the story. Organizations like the HOA rarely stop entirely. They may regroup, find new strategies, or target new properties. Vigilance would always be necessary, but I felt ready. I was no longer just a homeowner. I was a defender of my property. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The fight had been exhausting, but the victory was sweeter than I had imagined. Every threat, every late-night research session, every tense meeting in the courthouse had led to this moment, the realization that I had stood my ground and prevailed. As night fell, I lit a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace, poured a cup of coffee, and sat quietly. The crackling flames reflected on the walls, dancing like shadows of the struggle I had endured. I smiled to myself, feeling a sense of closure. My cabin, my dream, was finally safe. And yet, I whispered softly, almost to the mountains themselves, I've won this battle. but the fight for what's yours never really ends. The forest remained silent in reply, but I knew the truth. I had learned not just how to defend a home, but how to protect my peace, my sanctuary, and my rights. The mountains were mine, the cabin was mine, and for the first time in weeks, I could finally feel that elusive thing I had been chasing. All along, freedom.